Hello, welcome to the lecture titled Eisenhower's New Look Foreign Policy Part 2. I left you last time with a brief description of what the New Look Foreign Policy was and why it came into existence. We know Eisenhower was very much committed to the Truman Doctrine and winning the Cold War, but he was very much appalled that 60% of the federal budget was going toward defense in order to do so. And so he set out to craft his New Look Foreign Policy in a way that would enable the United States to win the Cold War, enforce the Truman Doctrine, but do it in a less expensive manner. And a central component of this was arming our allies, shrinking our traditional military, and building up our nuclear arsenal, and attaching to our nuclear arsenal the philosophical principles of brinksmanship and mutually assured destruction. Now, I left you talking about a component of the New Look Foreign Policy that was not really discussed openly throughout the United States, and this was the utilization of the Central Intelligence Agency. The CIA was going to operate in a very clandestine or secretive way to undercut communism where it might threaten. And certainly undercutting communism in the shadows was deemed to be much less expensive than doing it through traditional military means as well. So there was a level of consistency here, although the CIA required a great deal of expenditure, oftentimes in the form of large bags of money filled with unmarked bills. But we'll understand that a little bit more as this lecture proceeds. Now, if we turn to slide number 2, we'll see that I'm going to highlight 3 different countries that were very much on the radar of Dwight Eisenhower during his presidency. Now, there were numerous countries that were very much of concern to President Eisenhower and primary foreign policy experts in the United States. So this is really just an example, and what I attempted to do here is provide a regional example for each region throughout the United States. We'll take a look at Asia, and Vietnam will be our representative country there, although there are many Asian countries that were very much impacted by the Eisenhower administration. We know Vietnam is a central issue in U.S. Cold War history, so we'll talk about Eisenhower's role in making that so. Middle East very much is going to be impacted by the Cold War and U.S. foreign policy during the Eisenhower administration, and we'll use Iran as our example, and I think Iran's a good choice because we know Iran is still very much an important country in regards to U.S. foreign policy. And for Latin America, we use Cuba, and Cuba was something that all Cold War presidents and beyond have had to wrestle with the rise of Fidel Castro and the implementation of communism right in the backyard of the United States, becoming kind of an icon of how the United States, as powerful as it was, as powerful as it is, can only go so far in influencing the affairs of the world. And so that will prove to be a good example for us. But there are many other Latin American examples that we could have used to discuss the New Look foreign policy in Latin America, Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and so forth and so on. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with Vietnam. And perhaps before we move to slide number 3, I'll just mention this heading here, domino theory. The domino theory was something that Truman certainly adhered to. Eisenhower was going to be credited with really coining the phrase. But it's the idea that communism must be contained to where it already exists, because if communism infiltrates one country, then it will gain momentum and spread into the next country, and if it spreads into the next country, it will spread into the contiguous country of that country, and like a stack of dominoes, if you stack them up one after another, one after another, one after another, if you hit the first one, then it triggers this process until all of the dominoes have fallen. And that was the idea of the domino theory. If communism makes its way into one country, it will trigger the spread of communism throughout the world. And so Eisenhower is bent on preventing communism from spreading into the third world, even into countries that had limited natural resources or had limited economic ramifications for the United States. The mantra was enforce the Truman Doctrine, enforce the Truman Doctrine, enforce the Truman Doctrine throughout the entirety of the world. Okay, so now let's move on to Vietnam. You'll see on slide 3 a map that shows us Vietnam. Now we need to go back a little bit here to understand the context in which the New Look Foreign Policy meets Vietnam. Before World War II, France had colonized what was known as French Indochina, which included the future nation states of Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. But during World War II, we know that France is invaded by Germany and is routed. And this means that France, which really could not protect its own borders, was unable to protect its foreign empire, opening up a real opportunity for Japan to move into French Indochina and expel the French. And that's exactly what happened. We know during World War II, as Germany was carving up Europe, as Italy was moving into North Africa and the Middle East alongside Germany, Japan was carving up Asia. Japan had moved into Korea, into China, and eventually into the Philippines, and also down into French Indochina. And certainly the Vietnamese people, like the Chinese people, like the Korean people, were going to resist the encroachment on their land by the Japanese. And so things were bloody and brutal and contested. Now, certainly Japan ends up losing the war. 2 atomic weapons are dropped on Japan shortly afterward. There's a surrender. Japan recedes from the territory in Asia that it had occupied. And now the question becomes, who is going to be the national leaders of these countries in which Japan no longer occupies? And we saw the ramifications of this in the Chinese Civil War during our lecture on the Truman Doctrine. We saw the ramifications of this in Korea, as we also discussed in that same lecture. And the same sort of pattern is going to unfold here in Vietnam, but with a little bit of a twist. In Vietnam, we have a nationalist movement that is led by one Ho Chi Minh. Now, Ho Chi Minh had resisted Japanese occupation of Vietnam. He became somewhat of a cult figure throughout much of Vietnam. And one thing that Ho Chi Minh and the supporters wanted to prevent was a reoccupation of Vietnam by the French. And certainly France, now that World War II is over, wants to reobtain its empire. It wants to regain control of French Indochina, regain control of Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. But the Vietnamese nationalists under Ho Chi Minh are bent on obtaining their sovereignty, their autonomy, not be under the jurisdiction of some sort of foreign ruler. They did not want to be ruled by Japan. They didn't want to be ruled by France. They wanted to rule themselves. And France, of course, wasn't going to take no for an answer, so the French government is going to attempt to deal with Ho Chi Minh and deal with this Vietnamese nationalist movement. Now, the big issue here, makes it a big Cold War issue, is that Ho Chi Minh was a communist, and he wanted communism to be the dominant economic model of his country. He believed that this would be the best way to help the peasantry, help bring about a little bit more economic justice, and he was actually very much in support of some of the early American ideals. One of his big heroes was Thomas Jefferson, and for Ho Chi Minh, he did not see communism and democracy as mutually exclusive concepts. He believed that popular government could be in existence alongside a communist economy. Democracy is a political system. Communism is an economic system, and they could work together. And so as France and Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese nationalists are waging war, this becomes really a contestation. that the United States needs to be concerned with if the Truman Doctrine is going to be upheld. Because if the French are able to recolonize Vietnam, then of course Vietnam will be part of the capitalist world. But if Ho Chi Minh and the communists win, then that's going to be a new country that is part of the communist sphere, and ultimately the Truman Doctrine would have been struck another blow, just as was the case in China during the Truman administration. So with Eisenhower here, he's going to take a look at his New Look foreign policy, call a play, and that play is to support the French, but not by deploying the traditional military, but by providing the French with the resources necessary to fight their own conflict. By the time we get to 1954, 75% of the French military effort is funded directly by the United States. But it's still not enough. Ho Chi Minh and his forces are able to rout the French. Ho Chi Minh and his nationalist forces are able to rout the French at Dien Bien Phu, where the French had established a base, push the French all the way down in the southern part of Vietnam, and it looked as if Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese were going to be successful here. The United Nations gets involved hastily, charged with promoting, maintaining, restoring the peace. A truce is established, and it's determined that temporarily Ho Chi Minh and his Vietnamese nationalists will be in control in the north part of Vietnam, but below the 17th parallel, the United States is going to prop up a man, and you'll see him on slide number 4, named Nguyen Dinh Diem. Now, Diem here is Western educated. He lived in Paris for a lengthy period of time, was educated over there. He was a Catholic rather than a Buddhist, which was the dominant religion throughout Vietnam. And he's capitalist, pro-Western. And the determination coming out of the UN is that there will be a national election to reunify Vietnam. Diem will go up against Ho Chi Minh to be the ultimate leader of the reunified country, and it's determined pretty quickly by the United States that if the election is held on schedule, then Ho Chi Minh will win in a landslide, and through democracy, Vietnam would become a communist country. And this would be a huge blow to the United States' credibility throughout the world, and very much a devastating blow to American propaganda that asserted that the Cold War was a battle between democracy and communism rather than a battle between capitalism and communism. As Karl Marx once wrote, he believed that in some places around the world, communism could be developed, could come into existence through the ballot box, rather than through bloody revolution, and certainly this was something that the United States contested and certainly did not want to see actually develop. It would be much to their chagrin if it did unfold that way. So the United States, through its influence, was able to postpone the elections, and continually fund the Diem regime, which became increasingly totalitarian. The United States propping up Diem really struck a blow to the development of democracy in Vietnam. Diem shut down any semblance of freedom of speech, any semblance of freedom of the press. He persecuted the Buddhist majority and tried to impose Catholicism on the Vietnamese people. He was receiving bags of money from the United States, and all of this in the name of the Cold War. And so here we had a Ho Chi Minh who was willing to embrace the UN's proposal for democratic elections to reunify Vietnam, going up against a totalitarian ruler propped up by the United States in South Vietnam. And this, I think, is a real dark mark on the legacy of Dwight Eisenhower, somebody who was willing to really destroy democracy or not allow it to exist in Vietnam. Somebody who was willing to back a brutal totalitarian ruler in Diem in the name of winning this economic Cold War. And certainly that paints the U.S. foreign policy in a very kind of dark light, I suppose. Now, Ho Chi Minh and the North Vietnamese certainly are aware of what has transpired. Diem is a totalitarian ruler backed by the United States. The United States and Diem are not playing by the rules. Everything's being manipulated, so Ho Chi Minh and his forces end up crossing the 17th parallel, and the Vietnam conflict begins. But throughout the remainder of Eisenhower's presidency, he's going to continually fund Diem, continually fund his efforts to fight against communism, fight against Ho Chi Minh and his communist forces, and the problem is going to be passed over to John Fitzgerald Kennedy when he assumes the presidency. And it's going to be Kennedy who ends up deploying American forces to Vietnam in volume. By the time Kennedy is assassinated, there are 16,000 American quote-unquote advisors. These are men in khakis with machine guns. They're in South Vietnam fighting alongside the South Vietnamese against Ho Chi Minh and the North Vietnamese. But it's really not until after Kennedy's assassination that we get Lyndon Baines Johnson really turning up the heat. And by 1968, Johnson has deployed upwards of 500,000 American soldiers to that small little sliver of a country, had commenced Operation Rolling Thunder, in which bomb after bomb after bomb was dropped on North Vietnam in an attempt to enforce the Truman Doctrine and win this hot war in the midst of the Cold War. But it's during the Eisenhower administration in which we see the United States really first get involved in Vietnam. He does it by aiding our allies, and our ally ends up being Diem, who is this brutal totalitarian ruler who destroys liberties and fights against democracy. And unfortunately, this, I think, is an event that shows that the United States was not appealing to its better angels. It was more concerned about economics and capitalism winning out than it was about exporting democracy, preserving democracy, and promoting liberty and freedom throughout the world. So certainly we have to take this historical lesson and utilize it in our own times and into the future. We need to be aware of what is really behind the U.S. motives. When we deploy our forces around the world, why are we doing it? Is it for good, for bad, for ugly? Is the intelligence information that we get coming out of Washington legitimate or fabricated? I think we need to be a vigilant and aware citizenry to make sure that as citizens of the United States, our country does what is right and good, and that we actually live up to the ideals in which this country was founded upon, which are life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and equality of all men. So the Vietnam conflict begins here during the Eisenhower administration. U.S. Involvement, certainly in the form of aid, is increasing during the Eisenhower administration, but it's really during the Kennedy and Johnson administrations that the lid is going to be taken off, and troops are going to be deployed over there in volume, and the Air Force is utilized. And certainly this is going to roll into the Nixon administration as well. I mean, U.S. participation on one level or another in this Vietnam conflict lasts from the mid-1950s all the way until the mid-1970s, showing that it's much easier to get involved in war than it is to get out of war. 20 years of U.S. involvement, and ultimately a losing effort, as the North Vietnamese were ultimately able to wait out the United States. When the United States ended up leaving Vietnam, the North Vietnamese steamrolled over the South Vietnamese, reunified Vietnam as a communist country. So not exactly a great moment during the Eisenhower administration or in our nation's history. Okay, now let's go ahead and move to slide number 5 here. We'll move to the Middle East, specifically, and we'll move to Iran. Now, what we can say here about the Middle East is that the existence of hadn't been long since the Middle East was made up predominantly by tribes. But following World War I, many of the Western powers, most importantly England, went into the Middle East and began to draw boundaries as the Ottoman Empire had been cracked and broken up. There was somewhat of a power vacuum, and ultimately the drawing of these boundaries was undertaken not by the people who actually lived in the Middle East, but by dominant global powers such as England. And this creates some arguably intended or arguably unintended consequences, such as the cases in Iraq. We have this nation that is created here in the 20th century, following World War I, that is made up of Kurds and Sunni and Shia, and there's sectional conflict, creates a great deal of instability, and this instability arguably allows for Western powers like the United States or England or France to take advantage, utilize that instability to extract oil from the region. And there are some scholars out there who believe that this instability in the Middle East is actually welcomed by multinational corporations and governments that back them. And others dismiss that as nothing more than conspiracy. But certainly what we can say here in Iran is we have a relatively new country that is being modeled after that of England, which still has a lot of influence within the country. We have a monarch. If you go to slide 5, you'll see here in the 1950s during the Eisenhower administration, the Shah, or the king, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. But the Shah, much like in England, doesn't have universal authority over the country. There's no ruling by decree. There is going to be a popular government, a semblance of Republican government or democratic government, if you will. You have a parliament with a prime minister. So as you have in England, kind of a figurehead monarch, below that you have a parliament and a prime minister who makes the important political decisions for the country. Now, there was a lot of corruption. There was a lot of ill-gotten victories through the electoral process. Certainly the democracy in Iran was not picture perfect, but we did have the bones in place for a government by the people, for the people, to ultimately develop. Now, here in the 1950s, we have the election of one Mohammad Mossadegh. And Mohammad Mossadegh was a nationalist who believed that Iran was being fleeced by England specifically. And there was a lot of grounds for this argument. England actually was the home of a large corporation known as British Petroleum, or BP, the fellows behind the Gulf oil spill not too long ago. But BP is a very important company to England because there's actually a hybrid relationship back here in the 1950s, private-public company in which about half of the company is owned by the British government and the other half by private investors. But BP had a really good relationship with Iran, at least from their perspective. Specifically, BP could come into Iran with its human resources, with its know-how, with its equipment, and of course run the oil fields. And ultimately, BP would be able to take approximately 90% of all the profits that came from Iranian oil for themselves, and left about 10% for the Iranian government to dispense of. Now, Mohammad Mossadegh thought that this was a ridiculous arrangement. This is Iranian oil at the end of the day. And he knew full well that in other Middle Eastern countries there was a much more equal relationship between British Petroleum, the British government, and the governments of those countries. For example, in Saudi Arabia, BP and the Saudi Arabia had kind of a 50-50 split. And so what Mohammad Mossadegh wanted to do is get an arrangement with BP that was more on par with those other arrangements. And of course, BP, England, was not going to renegotiate their agreement so quickly if they could avoid it. So Mohammad Mossadegh, this elected prime minister of the Iranian parliament, says, well, if you do not broker a more generous deal, then we are just going to nationalize the oil fields. And what this means is that the Iranian government is going to take over the oil fields and run them themselves. They believe that they can do it without English know-how and English manpower, kick England and BP out. And of course, this is going to be a big issue back in England. BP generates so much revenue for the country. It's very lucrative and profitable. And so what will England do? Well, England doesn't really have the strength or the power to go into Iran itself and deal with this. It would much rather turn to its primary ally, the United States, to assist them. During the final days of the Truman administration, Truman says, no, I'm not going to get involved with this. And but now there is a new president, and Eisenhower. Eisenhower is going to have a little bit more of an open ear to these English pleas, and certainly the Eisenhower administration is ultimately going to play ball with English gestures for the United States to do something here. Now, in short, England is unwilling to broker that more favorable relationship with Mohammad Mossadegh and the Iranian government. So Mohammad Mossadegh nationalizes the oil fields. Now England can make the claim that Iran is socialist or even communist. It has taken over private property and is now operating through the state, which of course is socialism. And the United States needs to get involved to make sure that socialism or communism doesn't spread throughout Iran and throughout the greater Middle East. Now, here's the problem. Eisenhower recognizes that Mohammad Mossadegh has been elected through a democratic process, as corrupt as it was. He was still very much popular amongst the Iranian people and was trying to put forward a program that would enable Iran to generate revenue from its greatest natural resource in oil and use that revenue to build up its infrastructure, its industry, its school system, and become a modern nation. And so it was very much a populist movement. So if Eisenhower goes in there and completely does away in a transparent sort of way with Mossadegh, that means the United States is meddling in the affairs of another country that has embraced democracy. And so Eisenhower can't do that. The United States would lose face throughout the entire planet. Countries around the world would say, what is the United States really all about? I thought the United States was about democracy, but at the end of the day, the United States is toppling democracy. The United States cares more about multinational corporations or national corporations or profit than anything else. So instead of invading Iran, instead of going in there like gangbusters and routing Mohammad Mossadegh, the CIA is given permission to go in there and handle the issue secretly. Now, the CIA goes to the Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi and tells the Shah, hey, what we need you to do is put Mohammad Mossadegh under house arrest, dismantle his government, and obtain control of Iran yourself as a totalitarian ruler, and return the oil fields to British Petroleum. And Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi says, well, I'm afraid to do this. I don't think that I have the ability to do this. The Iranian people will turn on me. And so the CIA says, well, you don't really have a choice. You need to do this, or, we're going to do something about it. The Shah says, okay, well, what I'll do is I'll leave the country, and when it's safe, I'll come back and I will establish myself as the totalitarian ruler of Iran and make sure that those oil fields are returned to British Petroleum. Okay, so that the CIA now is going to get on with its efforts. What it does is it begins to bribe and even purchase radio stations and newspapers, begin the process of discrediting Mohammad Mossadegh. A smear campaign is underway. He's accused of being everything from a pedophile to taking money on the side and being corrupt. He's not to be trusted. There is a lot of money given to individuals that will form these kind of ragtag mobs. There is going to be some money dispensed to hire these mobs that are going to pretend to be supportive of Mohammad Mossadegh. They're going to destroy property, and so if they're in support of Mossadegh and they're radicalized, then that means Mossadegh's radical. So there's all this effort here to discredit Mossadegh. A great deal of money is being put forward to destroy his reputation. And when you create this destruction of property and these protests in the streets, people are fearful, they're scared, society is being turned on its head, and this really creates the opportunity for the Shah to return, give the military permission to go out there and break up these mobs, take Mohammad Mossadegh under house arrest, and dismantle the parliament and consolidate power for himself. And once he's able to do that, with complete control of the military, now he's able to return the oil fields to BP, and we end up having the solidification of totalitarianism in Iran. And it becomes known that the way that this ultimately unfolded was through the CIA, through the United States government itself. And Iran is going to stay relatively impoverished, with most of its oil revenue going to BP rather than being pumped back into the Iranian nation itself. There's going to be some significant poverty that ensues. And this becomes known throughout Iran. I mean, we don't really talk about this in the United States very much. We don't really talk about this part of our history because it's not very flattering to the United States. But there's a reason why many people in Iran and throughout the Middle East do not like the United States. It's in large part because of this Cold War legacy in which the United States helped in the pirating of their natural resources and the destruction of any sort of popular government that might emerge there in exchange for totalitarian regimes that would give in to multinational or national corporations or foreign governments. And throughout the 1950s and 1960s and into the 1970s, the Shah remained in power. There was no freedom of press, no freedom of speech, and Iran stayed a relative backwater as a result. And it wasn't until 1979 that, unfortunately, a radicalized Islamic fundamentalist movement ended up ousting the Shah, taking over power for themselves, and creating a government that is utterly hostile to freedom and liberty themselves, and very much hostile to the United States for its role in propping up the Shah to begin with and meddling in their internal affairs and preventing them from using their natural resources for the betterment of their country. And so, of course, to this very day, the United States has a strained relationship with Iran. And this is one of the great, what could have been moments in American history. I mean, here in Iran, this large Middle Eastern country with a large population, with a burgeoning democracy, developing along the lines of the West, relatively secularized, and all of this is going to be smashed, destroyed in the 1950s through the efforts of the Central Intelligence Agency, through the efforts of the U.S. government. And ultimately this leads to the rise of a radicalized, fanatical Iranian revolution in which the Shah is ousted, and now there's this big problem on the hands of the United States government today. And what would the trajectory of Iran been had not the events of the 1950s unfolded the way they did? So let's leave it at that. I will recommend a book for you if you're interested in this topic at all. It's covered in brief in the textbook, but there's a great, relatively recent book out titled All the Shah's Men. All the Shah's Men, and it's a really good expose on how the CIA operated, specifically here in Iran, and is wrought with all the details necessary for you to really kind of flesh out this particular series of events in the midst of the Cold War. And it's not required reading for this course, so you do not need to read it to field the potential essay question, but it is a good book, and I would recommend it to anybody. Okay, now let's go ahead and move to Latin America. We'll move down to Cuba. And what we have in Cuba is a country that very much was influenced by the United States really since 1898. Cuba, through the assistance of the United States, was able to get its independence from Spain. But there was the famous Platt Amendment, which required Cuba to allow the United States to get involved in Cuban affairs whenever it saw fit. The United States used this Platt Amendment to make sure that there was a pro-U.S. government in place in Cuba for the benefit of American corporations. And so how does this work? Well, let's just fast forward up into the 1950s, where we have a ruler of Cuba named Florencio Batista. Now, Batista, of course, ruling the government, was able to establish governmental business relations in that particular country, and an important part of this is taxation. So you have American businesses in Cuba, some multinational corporations even in Cuba, and the way that this would work is you might have, say, a $10 million American company in Cuba, and so you have to pay taxes on that $10 million. Well, what that American company could do is have their property assessed at a much lower rate. So on the books, the company is only worth $1 million, so you only have a tax liability against that $1 million. And the Florencio Batista government would allow this to happen in order to make those American businesses happy. Now, the problem with this, of course, is that if those American companies, for example, are not paying their fair share of taxes, well, that means there's less revenue that the Cuban government has at its disposal to build up its infrastructure, build up its healthcare system, build up its educational system. So Cuba is going to stay in a relative state of backwardness and poverty. Now, a whole slew of revolutions break out throughout Latin America. This is Che Guevara, right? This sort of Yankees rising up and trying to take control of their own affairs themselves, kind of a movement of liberation. And this rolls into Cuba, and the primary figure here in Cuba is going to be Fidel Castro. And Fidel Castro is successful in 1959. He's able to oust Florencio Batista and establish himself as the ruler of Cuba. Now here he is. He's the new ruler of Cuba, and he takes a look at these American companies and these other foreign companies in Cuba and says, well, this doesn't seem to be fair. They're paying such a low tax rate. How can this be? And he says, oh, I see what's going on here. They've been cheating all along. And so what Castro does is he approaches the owners of these companies and says, you know what, I'll buy your company from you, and I'll buy it from you at the assessed valuation. So this $10 million business, which is assessed at $1 million for tax purposes, he says, I'll give you $1 million for it. Now the owners of that business say, no way I'm going to sell my $10 million business for $1 million. Well, Castro says, well, if you don't sell it to me at the assessed value here in the books, then I'm going to nationalize it. And of course those U.S. companies and foreign companies aren't going to sell at these bargain basement prices, so Castro does nationalize them. He takes them over, and of course these corporations are going to go to their governments. The U.S. corporations will go to the U.S. government and say, hey, this isn't right. We've got communism developing here in the Caribbean, down there in Cuba. We need to do something about it. This isn't fair. And as you probably know, at least if you're as cynical as I am, when corporations go to the U.S. government, they usually have a government that is willing to protect their foreign investments, and oftentimes this leads to war. But Castro's rise to power didn't occur until 1959, and Eisenhower's time in office was limited at that point. In 1960, John Fitzgerald Kennedy narrowly defeats Richard Nixon, assumes the presidency in 1961, and through the readings you'll learn of the Bay of Pigs invasion. That was developed during the Eisenhower administration but not implemented until the Kennedy administration, in which the CIA attempted to oust Castro, but it proved to be a failure. Kennedy did not give up there. He authorized the CIA operation known as Operation Mongoose, in which there were numerous assassination attempts against Castro. This would continue into the Lyndon Baines Johnson administration, and Castro survived those assassination attempts. And in short, Fidel Castro was able to outlast Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Clinton, George W. Bush, and he's still around during the Barack Obama administration. And there's been a quarantine against Cuba. Cuba's been kind of blocked from participating in economic exchanges with American allies. It's kept Cuba very poor. But really this is a Cold War relic in Fidel Castro, and proved to be somewhat of a major thorn in the side of the United States as the Cold War unfolded. But as we can see with Fidel Castro, like him, love him, hate him, or be neutral on him, he is this kind of populist leader in Cuba who is attempting to oust foreign influence and establish programs that will help the poorer element of society. And that is certainly consistent with the efforts of Ho Chi Minh and consistent with the efforts of Mohammad Mossadegh. And we can see that during the Eisenhower administration, during much of the Cold War, the United States is more bent on making sure that there is a capitalist economy opened up that give disproportionate advantages to American corporations and corporations coming out of the West at the expense of the native populations of those countries, at the expense of the Iranians themselves, at the expense of the Vietnamese themselves, at the expense of the Cubans themselves. And that is really kind of a horrible component of this Cold War, that the United States loses track of its love of democracy and emphasizes economics over liberty and freedom. So with that said, we will come back for a third and final lecture on the Eisenhower New Look foreign policy. But as you can see on the ground floor here in Vietnam, Iran, and Cuba, there's a little bit left to be desired. Okay, I'll see you on the next lecture.